Hey, everybody. It is Wednesday, April 24th. You're listening to the Mo News Podcast. I'm Moshe Wanunu. This, of course, is the place where we bring you just the facts and we read all the news and read between the lines so you don't have to. It'll just be me on the podcast today. We were off the last couple days for the beginning of the Passover holiday. Jill is off the rest of the week. So you'll have me doing it solo for the next couple days. Appreciate all the kind notes you guys sent. Apologies for leaving you without your daily fill for a few days. But we are back, or I should say I am back, at least this week, with your headlines. And so let's get started here with what we know as we begin this Wednesday, April 24th. We're going to begin with the latest chaos on college campuses as tent communities have popped up on campuses from East Coast to West Coast. Pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel protesters making demands of their college campuses. Several campuses have called in the police to conduct arrests as policies have been violated, but they continue to grow. They've gotten the attention of Washington as some Republicans are now calling on President Biden to send in the National Guard. Meanwhile, also in Washington, the U.S. Senate passing a major foreign aid bill, $95 billion, as well as that TikTok provision, forcing the company to sell or be banned in the U.S. It's getting close to a signature from President Biden. The latest projections are in. We're going to be facing a record hot summer. I'll tell you about the only state they say you shouldn't expect above average temps in. The state of Tennessee moving ahead with its bill to give teachers guns in the classroom. Back to Washington, we'll tell you why Speaker Johnson is apologizing to President Biden in a moment that feels like we're back in the 1980s in D.C. again. Also in tech news, Apple having a lot of trouble selling its Vision Pro goggles. Women's basketball superstar Caitlin Clark signing a huge deal with Nike. I'll tell you about it. And finally, of course, we'll end with On This Day in History. But let's begin here with the chaos on college campuses. Over at Columbia University on the Upper West Side of New York, they announced yesterday that most classes will be held in a hybrid manner for the rest of the semester that lasts for another week or so. It comes as the campus is up security amid growing pro-Palestinian protests on the campus. In fact, they've locked their gate to anyone without a school ID. The president of Columbia, her name is Minouche Shafik, says the reason for calling for hybrid classes, remote classes, the rest of the semester is intended to, quote, de-escalate the rancor and give us all a chance to consider next steps. It comes as the university has been struggling to contain protests since late last week. They escalated in the aftermath of the more than 100 arrests on Thursday. The university calling in the NYPD to take apart a tent community anti-Israel protesters had put up, violating multiple university policies and rules. So they had those arrests last Thursday. The tent encampment has returned as of this weekend, and it includes both students and university personnel, as well as what appears to be some outsiders who've gotten involved in this tent encampment. The pro-Palestinian protesters who are trying to call attention to the situation in Gaza and making a bunch of demands on the university. I've also gotten some backup from faculty members at Columbia. The demonstrations, these tent encampments have inspired similar moves from college students across the country. You've seen them also in New York City at NYU, down in the Village, as well as out in California at UC Berkeley, up in Massachusetts at Harvard University, MIT, at Yale University in Connecticut, at the University of Michigan and Ann Arbor, as well as the University of Minnesota, among a few others, as we try to track all of them. And what the students appear here on principle to be calling for is, one, a divestment from all things Israel. They're calling on their universities, many of which have multi-billion-dollar endowments invested in the stock market, to sell any ETF, any holdings in companies that do any business with Israel. We're talking about companies like Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Airbnb. They also want, in many cases, their universities to drop any partnerships they have with hospitals in Israel, as well as any study abroad programs that they have with the country. But the protests have gotten increasingly threatening, increasingly violent at times, especially on Columbia's campus. A number of concerning incidents, threats, chants that have led to widespread attention and concern about the situation. In fact, one campus rabbi at Columbia University telling his Jewish students to avoid campus for their own safety. The thinking is by taking classes remote at Columbia, for instance, they're ensuring that students can be secure, feel safe by finishing their semester virtually. At the same time, leading critics of Columbia University saying administrators need to resign or take control of their campus immediately. Among the anecdotes that have been reported specifically from the campus newspaper at Columbia in New York City, Jewish students being told to go back to Poland, go back to the gas chambers, threatened with physical assault, chants of "We are Hamas" and "Bomb Tel Aviv," coming from demonstrators associated with the pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel protests. One video coming out this weekend with one of the protesters saying October 7th needs to happen 10,000 more times to Israelis. Also, one sign that got a lot of attention in one video, one of the anti-Israel protesters holding up a sign that says Qassam's next targets in front of a group of Jewish pro-Israel students. Qassam being the militant wing of Hamas. So basically saying this terror group needs to attack this group of people on our campus. Leaders at the city level in New York, state level, national level, including at the White House, condemning what they're seeing, some of the rhetoric they're seeing from these protests, some even comparing it to the Unite the Right rally that happened at University of Virginia back in 2017. That was a right-wing rally of white supremacists who said the Jews would not replace us. You might remember all the coverage around that. In this case, you have left-wing extremists who are talking about the need to eliminate Israel, the Jews not having a right to self-determination, etc. So a number of leaders saying this reminds them of that, and this anti-Semitism will not be tolerated. President Biden on Monday saying he condemns the anti-Semitic protests happening on campuses, as well as, quote, those who don't understand what's actually going on with the Palestinians. From Republicans on Capitol Hill, there are calls for Biden to send in federal law enforcement. Missouri Senator Josh Hawley, Arkansas Senator Tom Cotton, calling for Biden to send National Guard troops onto campuses to get control of the situation. Mitch McConnell, the Senate Republican leader, referring to the anti-Semitic pro-terrorist mobs on these campuses. And there are multiple calls from members of Congress and state officials, again, for university leaders to resign because of the situation that has unfolded on a few of these campuses. Again, the attempts at violence. There was an incident at Yale University where a Jewish student was attacked, and continuing threats that we see on a few of these campuses. Now, these student groups say they do not condone any violence. They are not anti-Semitic. They say in a number of cases that some of these more violent chants you're seeing are from outsiders who are engaged in the most violent rhetoric. This doesn't represent them. At the same time, we haven't seen much in the way of overt attempts to kick those elements out of the main encampments, which has led in large part to this concern among Jewish students on a few of these campuses that they are not safe. The protesters are also pointing to the fact that there are a few Jews who are taking part in these protests, who are against Israel as a Jewish state, though at the end of the day, the vast majority of Jews, it's estimated upwards of 90% plus of Jews, consider themselves to be Zionists who support the existence of Israel. I mentioned the violence, the arrests at Columbia. There have also been dozens of arrests at NYU, in New York as well. You saw the same thing happen over at Yale University up in Connecticut, and you saw it happen at University of Minnesota, where arrests took place on Tuesday. It's actually getting tough to track all of these various movements. Things are moving very quickly here, so we'll also have developments throughout the day over on Instagram. As it appears, a lot of universities here think they're stuck between pretty clear rules in terms of what they'll allow or where they'll allow protests, permitted protests, etc. And at the same time, a concern about progressive students and faculty members who want them to be a little more lenient on those rules for the sake of free speech. But the larger concern here that you're hearing from government officials is that in some cases, what appears to be happening here is that free speech is descending into hate speech. And again, you see a group of students who are fearing for their safety amid these protests. Jewish students saying this is a double standard, this would not be tolerated if there were huge encampments targeting Black students, gay students, Asian students, but they feel as Jewish students that they're not effectively being represented. Again, protesters here are saying they're merely trying to raise attention to the plight of the Palestinians in Gaza. At the same time, the rhetoric, the pictures, the videos have gotten ugly in a number of examples in recent days. And it has led to some donors of some of these major universities to reconsider their gifts to the university. In particular, New England Patriots owner Robert Kraft. He said in the last 24 hours, he's pulling his support, his financial support for Columbia University over the treatment of Jewish students. Kraft has started organizations and donated a lot of money to fighting anti-Semitism. And he says he's very concerned about what's happening at Columbia. And he says he's no longer confident that Columbia can protect its students and staff. And so right now, he's not planning to give any more money. He's given tens of millions of dollars in recent years. Several other major donors, including billionaires, also reconsidering their gifts to Columbia. So a lot going on at more than a dozen campuses across the country. Calls for National Guard troops, arrests, and then protesters returning back to campus and rhetoric escalating beyond just advocacy for the Palestinian cause and into threats of violence and concerns about safety on some of these campuses. Now, we should note, for the most part, the groups that are involved in these protests are small, sometimes in the dozens or several hundred on campuses that often have thousands or tens of thousands of students, still getting a lot of attention here, a lot of concern as the school year winds down and many of these campuses head towards graduation and commencement in the coming weeks. All right, switching gears here to Washington, where the U.S. Senate moved forward with a $95 billion foreign aid bill yesterday. And the bill, which now heads to President Biden, includes $60 billion plus for Ukraine, $26 billion for Israel, as well as several billion for humanitarian aid for the Palestinians, as well as several $billion for Taiwan. The goal of this bill is to bolster Democratic allies, U.S. allies around the world who are fending off threats from the Irans, the Russias, and the Chinas. Now, the Senate already passed a version of this several months ago. They've been ready to push forward with foreign aid for a while. The big holdup was in the Republican-led U.S. House, where the majority of Republicans there, in particular, were opposing further aid to Ukraine. Several folks on the far right wanting no compromise with Democrats altogether, wanting measures on border security. But of course, at one point, there was a measure on border security here that was rejected by Republicans. So ultimately, despite the huge fight the last few months, this foreign aid bill going through with no border security measures, because what was offered by Republicans and Democrats in the compromise was rejected by a number of conservatives in the House and the Senate. So a $95 billion foreign aid bill now goes to President Biden's desk for signature. But the fact that it got through the House means Speaker Johnson, the Republican speaker, is in trouble with his far right flank. Again, they did not want him to compromise. He was able to pass it through with the help of Democrats. They were not happy about that. There's actually now 3 members of the Republican caucus in the House who want him to go. They want to kick him out like they did Speaker McCarthy last year. Among them, Marjorie Taylor Greene. She's been making the big push there to kick out Johnson. Whether she'll actually be able to do it, whether she'll move forward with it, and whether Democrats might save him this go around, unlike McCarthy, all up in the air. So that's the drama we'll watch in the House. Back to the aid, though. Ukraine getting about 2/3 of this big package that was passed last night. It has said for months that it is an urgent need of aid. They're running out of weapons and running literally out of bullets to fight off the Russians, who are starting to make gains again as they already control about 20% of Ukraine in the 3rd year of the war. The Europeans have been sending in aid, sending in military gear, but nothing compares to U.S. weaponry in terms of the size and the quality here. So Ukrainian fears assuaged for now, as it appears this aid package is headed their way. Notably, this bill that passed the Senate last night includes a provision that requires the White House to send Congress within 45 days what the strategy is in Ukraine. That's been a big concern among mostly Republicans, saying you have this open checkbook to Ukraine, but what is the end game here? What is the plan? It does not look realistic that Ukraine can take back all of its land. So how long will we let this continue? What is the way we end this war? Will Zelensky and Ukraine have to make compromises, sadly, on the territory that have been taken so far from Putin? So we will await that in late May, early June from the White House, since that's a provision of this foreign aid bill. What is the strategy here? Then beyond Ukraine, you have the component for Israel. Most of it actually has to do with anti-missile defense against Iran, against Hezbollah. Some of the weapons you saw on display and saw used more than a week ago as Iran attacked the Israelis. This is replenishing the stock of those weapons. An interesting fact here, across the board, when you look at the $95 billion aid bill Congress passed, about 3/4 of it, 77%, is actually going to end up being spent here in the U.S. So while it's called foreign aid, most of it will be spent here. Think about the aid as effectively a gift card that's being given to the Israelis, the Ukrainians, the Taiwanese, that ultimately can only be spent here in the U.S. with weapons manufacturers here in the U.S. and factories here in the U.S. So the argument from those in Capitol Hill was ultimately this is an economic stimulus plan for a number of states across the country, as the Israelis, the Ukrainians, the Taiwanese will be spending a lot of the money that ostensibly has been given to them here in the U.S. One other item attached to this foreign aid bill, TikTok. Congress does have a tendency to do this, attack typically unlinked items to get them all through, pass them all through quickly. So we told you a couple months ago, the House passed this TikTok must sell or be banned bill. This is the latest version of it that was passed again by the House and now the Senate, attached to the foreign aid bill. The bill basically gives the owner of TikTok, ByteDance, the Chinese company, 2 options. 1, sell TikTok to an approved non-Chinese owner, or 2, be banned here in the US. The previous version of the bill gave ByteDance 6 months to sell. This version gives them up to a year. This was a suggestion at some members of the Senate who said a year feels like that'll pass legal muster. 6 months felt too short. And the concern from the director of the FBI, other national security officials here in the U.S., is that the Chinese government can access data from TikTok, spy on American users, and also spread disinformation and conspiracy theories by accessing the algorithm. Remember that no company is completely private in China. The Chinese government does have ultimate authority, though we have gotten consistent denials from TikTok and ByteDance that the Chinese government can do anything with TikTok. That said, it now appears like the TikTok must sell or be banned bill is actually going to hit the president's desk. Biden has said he will sign it. Well, will this actually go down? That's the big question here. And if you talk to experts, and I've talked to a few folks in the last couple of days, it appears it could take a couple of years before this actually happens. So while we sit here in April of 2024, between this getting signed, the 1 year TikTok has, the fact that TikTok will sue and judges will probably freeze the time frame here, means that as this thing winds its way through federal court, you might see the Supreme Court rule on this in a year or two. It might be into 2026, 2027 before this gets finalized. And remember that we have an election this fall. And if former President Trump gets reelected, he has said he's not interested in banning TikTok anymore or requiring them to sell. He's not as concerned as he once was. Remember, he was the one who first came up with the TikTok ban several years ago. He says that his concern with TikTok going down is that it'll only make Meta more powerful. He says that Meta, owned by Mark Zuckerberg, Facebook, Instagram, is more dangerous from Trump's vantage point. He believes they're anti-conservative, and despite being an American-owned company, he's concerned about them. Also factoring in here, one of Trump's biggest new donors, a billionaire donor, happens to own a good share of ByteDance. And so there's a belief that that is playing a role here in Trump's flip-flop on the issue. So bottom line here, foreign aid goes through Ukraine, Israel, humanitarian aid to the Palestinians, Taiwan, as well as this TikTok. Parent company must sell or be banned in the U.S. So a lot there that we'll be monitoring in the coming days, weeks, and in the TikTok case, the next couple of years. All right, we have a lot more to get to in today's podcast. But first, I want to tell you about one of our longtime partners here at Mo News, Athletic Greens AG1 powder. We're always talking about health trends, food trends, how hard it is to get all your nutrients. And one way I like to get them is by using AG1 powder. It's just one scoop with a glass of water in the morning. It's easy, it's quick. You can replace multiple health supplements like multivitamins, digestive aids, immune support with just this one simple scoop. You're getting stress support from things like folate, magnesium. You're getting immune health from vitamin C and zinc. And so it's a great way to cover your nutritional bases and set yourself up for success in just a few seconds in the morning. And right now they have a special deal for the Mo News community with your first purchase of AG1. Athletic Greens is giving Mo News listeners a free 1-year supply of vitamin D and 5 free travel packs of AG1. Visit drinkag1.com/Mo News. That is drink A, the letter G, 1, the number 1.com/Mo News. Drink ag1.com/Mo News to take advantage of this offer and really start to take ownership of your health. All right, now time for the speed read. We begin here with this from Axios. A hotter than usual summer is likely in most of the U.S., according to new forecasts and scientific research. Hot weather, particularly prolonged heat waves, will be threatening the nation's strained electricity grid this summer, so be on the lookout. And while we continue to face record temps here, there's a couple factors in particular that are concerning scientists this summer. One is that ongoing El Nino event in the Pacific Ocean is fading and transitioning to the La Nina cycle. So these are the cycles you see every couple of years. The transition year, when it happens during the summer, often leads to way above average temps. You're seeing this with ocean temps right now. So the fact that it's a El Nino to La Nina transition summer is particularly concerning. On top of that, of course, is climate change. We have now seen 11 straight months of record warm temperatures on planet Earth. That takes into account the entire Earth, the hemisphere that's seeing winter, as well as the hemisphere that's seeing summer. Net, the temps are up, and they continue to go up. As far as here in the U.S., a recently released NOAA climate outlook that takes us from June into August shows that only one state, North Dakota, has a chance for below average or average temperatures this year. Meaning everywhere else, you're very likely to see above average or very above average temps this summer. The chances for hotter than average conditions are highest in the Northeast in the U.S., as well as a vast swath that takes you from West Texas into the Rockies, into the Pacific Northwest, where I know a number of you don't have air conditioning, but have been getting AC units in recent summers due to these record temps. Beyond the U.S., Europe in particular is vulnerable to the heat this summer as well, also particularly vulnerable to climate change. The number of heat-related deaths in Europe has increased by at least 30% over the last 20 years. The rapid warming in Europe is driven by a few factors, including how close most of Europe is to the Arctic being the fastest warming region on Earth right now. Also, it's naturally situated near the warm ocean and atmospheric currents. That's why London's winters are so much more temperate than Chicago's, because of those warm ocean currents. That's the good part, right? That they don't have these super cold winters. At the same time, because they have those atmospheric currents, it also means that Europe is getting dangerously hot more quickly than other places from similar latitudes. So what's good in the winter is not good in the summer. All right, next up here from NPR, the Federal Trade Commission narrowly voted on Tuesday to ban nearly all non-competes. These are employment agreements that typically prevent workers from joining competing businesses or launching ones of their own. In recent months, the Federal Trade Commission received more than 26,000 comments leading up to this vote. The FTC estimates that about 30 million people, or 1 in 5 American workers, from minimum wage owners up to CEOs, are currently bound by non-compete policies. Now, with this vote, the policy could lead to increased wages totaling, FTC estimates, $300 billion a year by now encouraging people to be able to swap jobs freely. The ban on non-competes will take effect later this year. It carves out an exception for existing non-competes that companies have already given senior executives on the grounds that these agreements are more likely to have been negotiated, again, with the senior exec ranks. The concern the FTC had in particular is the non-competes being imposed upon lower wage earners. The vote at the Federal Trade Commission was 3-2 along party lines. The dissenting conservative commissioners saying that the FTC is overstepping its boundaries here. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce, also a right-leaning group that represents businesses, saying they're going to be suing the FTC to block this rule. They say this is unlawful. They say it's a power grab here by the Trade Commission, that businesses should be able to have non-compete policies without infringement, without the intervention of the U.S. government. So this is one of those stories that we'll also be talking about for the coming months and years, as this will get litigated up through the various courts here. Also keep in mind, if former President Trump gets reelected in November, this likely goes away with his Federal Trade Commission. All right, next up, we have this from the Tennessean newspaper. Lawmakers in the state of Tennessee on Tuesday passed a bill that will allow the state's teachers to carry concealed handguns at school. It came as there were major protesters yelling their opposition from the gallery as they were voting on this. Now, Tennessee has Republican supermajorities, so the vote here on Tuesday was more than 2-1 in favor of the legislation. Now, Tennessee has seen heated debate, we've told you about it, over gun laws since last year's shooting at a Nashville school that left 3 children dead and 3 adult staffers dead as well. Some of the Democrats in the House have helped lead protests inside the Capitol. Remember, there was the expulsion of a couple reps last year. Now, Republican lawmakers in the state say that one of the solutions here to school shootings is arming teachers. They say that that has been a response that will deter would-be school shooters. Critics here saying that guns in school will only lead to accidental shootings. Right now, about half of all states in the U.S. allow teachers or other school employees to carry firearms on school grounds. Under this bill in Tennessee, any person wanting to carry a concealed handgun in a school would have to complete at least 40 hours of training in school policing. Now, this is notable. The identity of the teacher or staffer who is carrying a gun would not be public, according to the bill. School leaders must give approval for the person to carry a gun. Local law enforcement leaders must be informed of their identity. But I did hear from a number of you who are parents in Tennessee who said that you'd be very concerned if you didn't know if the teacher in the classroom your child was in was armed or not. Again, the concern from critics here is that this will lead to accidental deaths. The case by proponents is that this will deter school shooters. All right, back to Washington here with this fun little story from Politico. You might remember at Biden's State of the Union earlier this year, Speaker Johnson got a lot of reaction for his facial expressions as Biden gave the speech, as he sat behind him, from Republicans who agreed with Johnson's eye rolls, Democrats who thought it was disrespectful. Well, the Politico newspaper reports that this past March, just last month, Speaker Johnson felt he owed Biden an apology. The two were on Capitol Hill for a Friends of Ireland luncheon, where Speaker Johnson toasted Biden as America's most famous Irishman. And then, according to the newspaper, Johnson pulled Biden aside and said he apologized for all the eye roll memes that went around the world. According to the newspaper, the president laughed it off. He said that he was glad Johnson was better behaved than Nancy Pelosi was during Trump speeches. Biden telling Johnson, "I'm just grateful you didn't rip my speech up." Speaker Johnson apparently replied to Biden, well, Mr. President, don't think my friends back home didn't want me to light your speech on fire. Anyway, I put that anecdote out on Instagram yesterday, and a number of you saying, even if you disagree with the politics of Biden or Johnson, it was very quaint to hear that they could have a conversation like that. An apology could go down between parties. It almost felt like the 1980s again. A lot has been made of the relationship between Tip O'Neill, then Democratic Speaker, and President Ronald Reagan, then Republican president. This conversation sounds like a relic from a bygone era. All right, a bit of tech news here from the website Mac Rumors. Apple has dropped the number of Vision Pro units that it plans to ship this year, going from an expected 800,000 units down to about 400,000 units. So literally cutting the number of Vision Pros in half as they see a lack of demand. The Vision Pro initially launching in the US, now launching globally. But Apple analysts saying they're seeing demand fall, what they say, sharply beyond expectations. They're taking a very conservative view here of how many of these units they'll actually be able to sell. Remember, these were the sort of new techie goggles Apple had a lot at stake on, thinking that this will finally be the augmented reality, virtual reality item that everyone is going to want to have in their home. At the same time, the technology here continues to be a bit too cumbersome to use on a daily basis. Going through the process of attaching a battery, charging a battery. It only works for a couple of hours, booting it up, navigating the interface. Many people just don't find it worthwhile. And then there's the price tag, costing anywhere between $3,500 and $4,500 for each unit. And finally, a bit of sports news here from the AP. Caitlin Clark appears to be on the cusp of setting another record. We've told you about the prolific scorer who set the scoring record for both men and women in NCAA college hoops. She was recently the number 1 overall pick at the WNBA. And while a lot has been made of the fact that her salary is only $76,000 in the first season due to a lot of limitations that WNBA has, including limited revenue, Nike has signed Caitlin Clark for what appears to be a $28 million contract that'll span 8 years and include a signature Caitlin Clark shoe. Apparently, everyone was bidding here. Puma got in. They found out it was getting too expensive. They got out. Under Armour, Adidas were also talking to Clark's team. Again, not willing to shell out as much as Nike here, which, according to the Wall Street Journal, has offered up $28 million over 8 years to sign up Caitlin Clark. All right, and we end here with On This Day in History. We begin in the year 1800. The Library of Congress was officially founded on this day by President John Adams. He approved $5,000 to acquire, quote, such books as may be necessary for the use of Congress. Today, it is now the largest library in the world, not just for Congress, but notably just a few years after the Library of Congress was created, it was burnt down by the British as they tried to take America back in the War of 1812, all 3,000 plus books at the time burning in that fire. That would then lead to a certain former president, President Thomas Jefferson, to say, all right, I will sell you all of my books to restart the Library of Congress. So former President Jefferson at the time actually had 6,000 plus books, double what burnt. And so President Jefferson's collection would end up restarting the Library of Congress. Again, today, the largest library in the world. All right, fast forward to the 20th century here. On this day in 1980, a failed military operation to rescue the more than 50 American hostages held by the Iranian regime failed. It actually resulted in the deaths of 8 U.S. service members. This happened in the final year of President Carter's presidency. Following the failed rescue, the hostages would remain in the custody of the Iranian regime for more than 270 days, eventually released the following year, just as Ronald Reagan was being inaugurated. All right, in sports news, a happy 28th birthday to the WNBA, founded on this day in 1996. A little pop culture here. Sorry, Jill is missing this. On this day in 1997. George Costanza's new girlfriend uses the term yada, yada, yada to shorten her stories. Yada, yada, yada becoming one of those cultural zeitgeisty things of the late 90s. And we end here with a couple musical items. On this day in 1989, 35 years ago, Tom Petty releasing his first solo studio album, Full Moon Fever, featuring, among other hit songs, I Won't Back Down. And on this day, 23 years ago, Janet Jackson releasing her 7th album, All For You. Janet has sold more than 100 million records over her career. All right, that wraps things up for this solo edition of the Daily Mo News podcast. Appreciate you guys sticking it out with me. I'll be with you the rest of the week. Jill's back next week. Be sure, if you haven't already, to go check out Mo News, The Interview. That has our deep dive into all things laundry, clearing up everything you might want to know about what detergents to use, what temperature to put things at, how to avoid shrinkage. We asked dozens of your questions to a senior scientist from Procter & Gamble who helps develop Tide and Downy in some of their products. And so we literally spoke to the person who tests dirty clothes and how to clean them on a daily basis to answer your questions. So check out the latest edition, episode 80, over at Mo News, The Interview, all things laundry. All right. Thanks for listening, everybody. I'll see you back here tomorrow.
Thanks for listening to the Mo News Podcast.